Good afternoon, everyone. The clock says it has turned to 1 o'clock. So I want to thank everyone for joining us for today's Badger Dairy Insight. We have three great topics and speakers with us today, covering a wide range of topics affecting fertility, touching a little bit on cow health, genomics, and whatnot. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it right over to our first speaker. Lyssa Seefeldt is the Eau Claire County Agriculture Extension Educator. Lyssa grew up in Marathon County on a diversified dairy and livestock farm. She received her Bachelor of Science and Master of Science in Animal Science from the University of Wisconsin-River Falls and South Dakota State Universities. Prior to joining Eau Claire County, she spent 6.5 years as an agriculture extension educator for Marquette County. With that, we're going to turn over to Lyssa. And just a quick note, forgot to say right at the beginning here, please enter questions in the chat. We'll be monitoring the chat as we go today, and also taking a couple of breaks between speakers for questions. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lyssa.
Thanks, Ryan. So today I'm going to be touching on some kind of high-level things that we can do to help make sure that we have successful transition periods. So I just wanted to set the stage a little bit why I decided to start digging into this topic. When I was digging into some statistics recently for counties that are in the area that I serve, I noticed that the milk per cow was averaging below the Wisconsin average, and it really got me kind of wondering why a lot of the counties in my area were under this average. The average in Wisconsin is 24,884 pounds of milk, and just what might be leading into that. And that's really what kind of got me started on this topic. One of the things that we can look at, there's a survey by the Department of Agriculture, Trade, and Consumer Protection here in Wisconsin, completed a farm survey back in March of 2020, right kind of before the pandemic really got going. So they had a pretty good return rate. They had 7,000 plus surveys that were distributed, and about 2,800 were returned, so approximately a 40% return rate, and about 816 of those surveys were returned for the Northwest region that covers farms in my area and to the north of me as well. And if we notice on this slide, a lot of the farms are skewed to the smaller side of things. So it prompted some conversations with me and some local farmers, veterinarians, and other agribusiness professionals. And I was hearing bits and pieces about some farms having issues with displaced abomasums, ketosis challenges, and some interest in smaller herd nutrition. So that's really what kind of prompted this discussion today. So we're going to talk about setting up for a successful transition period to make sure that we have that nice stress-free lactation that really helps us get to those better conception rates, and really what kind of easy to grab things we can do that can really help set those cows up for a good lactation. So there's really kind of three overarching points here that I want to talk about. We want to be limiting the time that a cow is spending in negative energy balance. We want to detect problems early and intervene as soon as we can. And we want to make sure that we're targeting appropriate welfare practices. Okay, so let's dive into energy balance and nutrition just a little bit. So if we think about how nutrients are being prioritized in a cow, their first need is always going to go to maintenance. They're always going to be maintaining their body first. And then we move on to, if the cow needs to grow, they're going to be putting some of that energy into growth. And then if they have a calf outside already, or on the ground rather, then we're going to be looking at maintaining that lactation. And finally, at the top of this kind of pyramid of needs is reproduction. So really, we have to meet the needs of these other three big stages before we can even tackle reproduction, which is why it's really important that we get this period right to set them up for success. So when we're talking about energy balance, we're really talking about if dry matter intake is not meeting our energy needs for that cow, that's where we have a deficit, a negative energy balance. And we really want to limit the time that a cow is in that negative energy balance, especially when she is approaching calving and then right after calving, because she has some really, really high nutritional needs during these 2 periods. In the week leading up to calving, there's a lot of hormone changes that are initiating changes to metabolism. Fat reserves are being mobilized, and they can be used as an energy source in the blood as in the form of non-esterified fatty acids, which then will spare some glucose for milk production. And these non-esterified fatty acids can be cleared from the blood through several paths, one of which is through partial oxidation, which is the path that is going to produce ketone bodies. And if we don't have enough energy to maintain the body of that cow or production, lactation, that's when that pathway really gets kind of ramped up, which can lead to ketosis and fatty liver. So really that activation of the fat mobilization during that transition period can be stimulating that inflammatory response, which is also going to be increasing that non-esterified fatty acid metabolism. And that triggering is what's then leading to some pro-inflammatory chemical messengers that are known as cytokines that just kind of keeps the cycle going and going. And that's what we really want to avoid. We don't want to be setting them up for that ketotic situation. So when we're managing, we really want to focus on making sure that we avoid that negative energy balance period as long as possible. We want to limit that time frame, and we want to support that cow in making sure that she can regulate that mobilization of fat reserves to try to avoid ketosis and fatty liver. So the key piece here is making sure that that cow maintains her dry matter intake. Any disruption to that dry matter intake is going to ultimately affect her ability to avoid some of those metabolic diseases that we're going to get into just a little bit more detail in a minute. We want to make sure that we try to avoid a big drop off as we're approaching calving. There's some natural drop off that occurs because of just the limitations of the rumen as that calf is growing, and some hormone changes that occur, but we want to do the best we can to prevent drop off, because that dry matter intake is really important. And so of course, to do this, we want to make sure that we have an appropriate diet, that we're working with our nutritionist to make sure we have that energy level where it needs to be at. And we also want to make sure that we're keeping that rumen filled with the correct diet to help transition those gut microbes to our lactation diet. So one of the things that we maybe have talked about, or you may have heard about in past presentations from other people, is what we call DCAD diets, so dietary cation anion difference. And these diets have become a management tool during the transition period. This cation anion management usually involves management of your potassium and sodium, which are the cations, and chloride and sulfur, which are your anions, through pH manipulation. And ultimately, if we do this correctly, this lets us manage our calcium around calving to, excuse me, around calving to prevent milk fever if we do it correctly. And one other thing to note is that our potassium levels of our forages are going to ultimately help determine the amount of DCAD products that we'd be utilizing if we're using the DCAD strategy. And our ultimate goal here is to formulate a lower potassium diet. And so one way that we can do this is through anionic salts. So these would be things like ammonium chloride, calcium chloride, magnesium chloride, ammonium sulfate, calcium sulfate, and magnesium sulfate. So those are all examples of products that people have been able to utilize. The challenge with the anionic salts is that they're not very palatable to the cow. So we do need to make sure that we're taking care to integrate them at appropriate levels so that we're not impacting that intake of the cow. And there may be some other DCAD type products that are available that aren't the anionic salts, for things that maybe have been treated with like hydrochloric acid that allow us to have better palatability for the cow, that can be a useful tool in our toolbox as well. So when we're looking at the DCAD diets, we can see decreased incidence of milk fever, increase in our calcium metabolism, and our decrease in the subclinical milk fever as well. And this strategy is appropriate for our older cows that have a couple of seasons under their belt. And one other thing to note, if we're using this diet, we can utilize urine pH to see if we're being effective, if we're utilizing the anion supplementation strategy. And that target urine pH is somewhere around 6 to 6.5. And if you get below that, so below a 6, you might be able to actually reduce your anion supplementation. And just for a baseline measure, cows that aren't fed that anion supplementation, they're going to have a more basic pH that's closer to 7.8 or 8.2. So let's talk a little bit about some early detection intervention strategies. So one of the easiest things that we can do is key times doing body condition scoring, which is just a visual measure of if we're actually meeting the nutritional needs of the cow. It's not the only measure that we need to be taking, but it is one that can help us ensure that we're getting appropriate dry matter intake for the cow. And if we're, looking at the cow at periodic times throughout that gestation and into lactation, we can keep an eye on how she's doing and make sure that we're adjusting if she's gaining, if she's losing, and make sure that we're managing that appropriately so that there's not big gains or losses at any one time, because that's a big red flag for intervention. So we do have some connections of when we see decreased incidences of milk fever, then we also see decreased incidences of retained fetal membranes, displaced abomasums, and botrytis. And fresh cows that are exhibiting displaced abomasum are actually linked with other metabolic diseases like ketosis, so it kind of makes sense. And the big contributing factor here, again, is inadequate intake, or if you have abrupt changes in diet, or if you have a diet that has really high grain content and inadequate fiber. Those are all things that can be contributing to those displaced abomasums and things that we want to avoid. Okay. And when we're talking about energy balance, we did kind of discuss a little bit about the scenario that sets that cow up for ketosis and production of ketones. And cows that are experiencing that prolonged negative energy balance, they lose body condition during the first 2 weeks following calving. And ones that have a higher body condition score, so greater than 3.5 on their score pre-calving, will actually lose more weight and body condition after calving. So a little bit counterintuitive to what you might think it is. So research has really shown us that fatter cows are going to have less immune function that's related to gene activation. And because of that, they have altered profile that shows some really acute inflammatory response that shows a link between that fat mobilization and our decreased immune function. So those cows that are those heavier body condition scores at the end of lactation actually end up eating less during their entire dry period, which leads to a larger body condition drop after calving, and ends up predisposing them to uterine related diseases such as retained placenta and metritis. So we've got a chart of different diseases that are associated with the transition period. And we know that when we start seeing these diseases, we're intervening too late, right? We start seeing these diseases pop up in our herd, and we've not been effective in identifying them early on. And these numbers, I believe, were pulled from somewhere around 2019 and are only going to have went up since then. And on the right-hand column here, we have that herd alarm level when if we're getting some high numbers in any one month, we maybe need to start taking a look at what we're doing with our diet and management practices, because we're approaching times when we're going to be having some significant farm impacts. And these are, just some guidelines. They're all going to be different based on your farm, but these are some general guidelines that may be useful to start with until you've established your own rates to be concerned of and your own farm goals. So the other thing that I've really thought a lot about as I've been digging into this topic more is, what can our smaller farms do to help make sure that our cows are doing well in that transition period. And, we might not have a lot of pens to be able to move animals in, and we might even be working in a tie stall. So one of the big things is that we need to think creatively when it comes to making sure that we're getting that appropriate diet into the cow. We want to make sure that we're preventing stealing of that mid-lactation diet. So that might mean that we're grouping transition cows in our tie stall kind of together in one area to make sure that it's easy to feed them the right diet. And we might be putting boards at the end of those feed areas, mangers, so that we make sure that those cows aren't stealing the diet next door that's not the right one. And if we don't have that capacity, maybe it's a matter of we have to have our dry cows in a different space, and especially those cows that are coming up a little bit closer in the transition period. Maybe they're in a separate area. Maybe we have a separate barn that we have them in for a while until we move them back into the main herd once they have calved. Okay, and then a couple last things to be thinking about. If we're regrouping animals, we should be trying to limit that to regrouping once per week if we need to do it. We want to be avoiding regrouping, especially when we're getting close up, because that's where there's going to be the most impact in the social hierarchy. And it's a critical point in the gestation period. We don't want to impact that dry matter intake because that is really important right as we're approaching calving and immediately after. And research has shown us that the social hierarchy, whenever we move cows around, is disrupted for at least 4 days. And so when that move occurs, there's going to be an average of 10 to 25 events where a cow is getting pushed out of the feed area by another cow, unless there's strategies to prevent that. And that can lead to a loss in milk once we've calved, or drop in dry matter intake for both periods before and after calving, which we don't want that dry matter intake to be messed with, because that is a very critical period. So strategies, if you have to move in at least a pair of cows, because that helps reduce bullying by if we've got a dominant cow in the group. And another thing to note is that anytime we regroup, that also impacts the lying time of those cows. So keep that in mind if you need to regroup. And then when we're talking about stocking density, we want to make sure that we're stocking at appropriate levels. And with transition cows, this really means that we need to be not exceeding 100% of our stocking density when we're looking at the far off groups. And this is going to be based on our headlock space, not necessarily stall space. And the reason I say that is because if we, for example, have a 3-row free stall, we're not going to have adequate bunk space to make sure that those animals have the ability to get to that bunk and not be impacted by a more dominant cow. And for the close-up period, we don't want to be exceeding 80%. And the reason why is, again, it's a very sensitive period. We don't want to be impacting that intake. So we need to make sure that we're thinking about that. We want to minimize disruptions to that feed intake because it really is critical. And then the other thing to note, we often forget, but it is critical, making sure that we have adequate water availability. That might mean we need more fountains available because that is important for maintaining gestation, and especially even more so once we hit the lactation period. So to summarize things, if we limit the time that the cow spends in negative energy balance, that's going to be our goal of our transition care. We want to make sure that we're detecting those problems early and intervening when necessary. And we want to make sure that we're targeting those appropriate welfare practices. And with that, I'd take any questions.
Thanks, Lyssa. Great stuff. And I think you make an important point that in Wisconsin, we still have a lot of diversity, different herd sizes out there, and takes a little thought into how you adapt some of these practices for different herd sizes. And then, if I understand right, this transition cows and how we do this, that's a topic you're going to be working a little bit more on throughout this year.
Yep. So if people have questions or want to dive into this more with me, I'm happy to chat and would love to hear from folks.
Great, thank you.